Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
We are facing the most serious threat to public media in history. Right now, the White House is trying to rescind already approved funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, money that keeps stations like ours running. Without it, essential local journalism, trusted reporting, and podcasts like this are all at risk. If you value public media, speak up now. Visit boisestatepublicradio.org/funding to learn more and take action.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. This past weekend saw a military parade in Washington, D.C., more than 2,000 No Kings rallies all across the country, with more than 5 million Americans participating, and the assassination of a Minnesota lawmaker. Now, all of this has many people asking what's happening to our country, and for that matter, our democracy. Dr. David Adler will be holding another constitutional conversation next week titled The Fraying of Consensus in American Politics and Its Implications for Our Constitutional Democracy. And Dr. Adler is joining us to give us a preview. Dr. Adler, nice to have you back on the program.
Thank you for having me, Gemma. Good to be with you.
So, Dr. Adler, you speak of the fraying of consensus in American politics and what you call its implications for our constitutional democracy. What do you mean by fraying of consensus?
You know, Gemma, I think that across our nation, Americans have lost confidence in the ability of our institutions to resolve our difficulties, to take on matters of great importance and to bring them to a head and a successful solution. And that loss of confidence in the institutions of America, I think, is causing the consensus in our country, so important to a democracy, if never more than 51-49, to fray. And that leads to a further erosion of American laws and norms and principles. And frankly, it inspires cynicism and dissembling and disinformation as people recognize an opportunity to exploit the nation's vulnerabilities. And as that rises, I think it opens pathways for demagogues to rise to power. And I think we're seeing that now in the form of Donald Trump's penchant for authoritarianism. And so if we see the fraying of consensus, it means that we're losing the vital social contract on which our nation is founded, the essence of which is that those in office will obey the Constitution and that the American people will obey the law. But as people perceive that there is great favoritism shown toward people with power or money, people are less inclined to place confidence in the courts and be willing to abide by the law, whether it's paying taxes, whether it's speeding, whether it's engaging in violence. And the greatest manifestation of this, Gemma, it seems to me, is the horrific increase in violence, political violence across the country, which, as you mentioned at the outset, was demonstrated anew in the tragic killings in Minnesota this past weekend.
So, Dr. Adler, I want to talk about a little bit more about, you say, this lack of faith in institutions, and you mentioned the courts as one part of this. I'm curious to know how we then can resolve our differences if we start to have a decline in our faith in these institutions. And can you maybe give some examples of that? Because there seems to be just a really deepening of cynicism in our politics on both sides of the aisle, right? I don't think, that this is a partisan issue. Everyone seems to be feeling this way in some sense, or most people at least.
Well, that's a good question, Gemma, because it's not merely loss of confidence in the courts, or at least growing doubt about the ability of the courts to mete out justice in accordance with the principles of the rule of law. But it's the first branch of government as well, and that is Congress. And people are becoming increasingly frustrated about the inability of Congress to address the major issues of our time. And when they perceive, rightly so, that so many members of Congress are particularly interested in the longevity of their careers rather than doing good things for the country, then they become not only cynical, but they are filled with despair. And it's when people are filled with despair and filled with cynicism that they then begin to embrace the ends justifying the means. That is to say, they want to achieve their own goals regardless of their relative legality, because they can justify it because it reflects their needs and their interests. And that represents the kind of fraying of consensus, the commitment to the social contract that I'm keen to talk about, because that's the vital principle on which our constitutional democracy rests. And there are all kinds of examples, and I'm glad you asked. One that is very demonstrative occurred this weekend when, after the horrific shooting in Minnesota, Utah Senator Mike Lee quickly said that Vance Bolter, the would-be killer, was a Marxist. And this is what happens when Marxists don't get their way. And that was a cynical leap for him, because if he had just waited a bit, he could have seen the interview with reporters that his roommate provided. That is to say, that he knew that Bolter was a committed Trumpian, that his profile, anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-abortion rights, fit the MAGA profile. And that would have led Senator Lee to a completely different conclusion. But I think what was going on there in his quick act was an attempt to exploit the situation, the immediate circumstances, for his own political gain. And that's the essence of cynicism in our country, and it's widespread and it's destructive.
Well, Dr. Adler, I mean, he doubled down though as well, because he also put another tweet out on social media with a picture of Belcher saying, "Nightmare on Walls Street," inferring to the governor of Minnesota. And I mean, at this point, Dr. Adler, it shouldn't matter at all where you stand politically, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, whether you are conservative or a liberal. It seems that everyone should condemn any political violence, because there has now been an assassination. The governor of Pennsylvania's mansion was burned. Current President Trump was almost assassinated last summer. This is not okay. And does this go back to this idea of, a failing democracy in a sense, when we can almost become almost unaffected, I guess, or that we find it okay to say, well, this is all right if they don't agree with us politically?
Well, that's a really important point. If at a minimum we become indifferent to murders and assassinations, then that's quite a tell on the American citizenry. What kind of people have we become? To your earlier point, in the wake of horrific acts such as those which occurred in Minnesota this weekend, those ought to be enough to bind the nation together. Those with a little bit of age under their belts will remember that after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, for example, that the right and the left came together, if for no more than a few weeks, to talk about their outrage. And the same was true after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. What this represents to me is the fact that the American people have come to a crossroads in the history of our nation where it's essential that we make a choice whether we're going to go down the road of authoritarianism, which is rising and gaining momentum, and all that it entails. The end justifies the means, the sacrifice of the rule of law, the loss of our constitutional rights, or whether we want to commit to democratic governance, a system in which we have an opportunity to participate in the formation of our laws and policies and programs. It's a stark choice. It's a very, very real choice that has to be made now. And so we look at this crossroads, I think, Gemma, and realize that we've not been here, at least since the Civil War, and that this represents the kind of unprecedented danger that the founding fathers feared, that a demagogue could reach the White House. And that's where we are now. And without putting too much weight on the responsibility of the president here, the reality is when the president justifies violence, praises violence, calls for his supporters to engage in violence, that has a huge impact across the nation. People feel permission then to engage in their own form of violence, and then that's destructive of the ends of democracy. And that's the choice that we have to make now. And I think it calls for all hands on deck to preserve our democracy at this point.
Well, with that said, Dr. Adler, Congress has the ability to temper and tamper down any president. And the power in so many ways is in the hands of Congress, not the hands of the president. With that said, I have about 2 minutes left with you. And I want to know then, in this moment in history, what is the role of citizens in resolving where we are and how we move forward?
Well, that's a very important question, Gemma. The reality is, as you say, that Congress has the full constitutional authority to stop authoritarian measures, to stop the usurpation of its power. It could begin to halt the aggrandizement of its important constitutional functions. It could, frankly, stand up and defend its constitutional turf. But the majority party in Congress is in thrall to President Trump, refusing to take actions independent of his will. And that tells us very plainly about the spell that the GOP has fallen under, the autocratic spell. And so we Americans then, in the short time we have left, have a key responsibility. And I think we saw that in the mass protests across this nation. Some 5 million strong turned out to register their opposition to the proposition that the president is a king. And there was a strong denunciation of those kinds of boasts of power. The No Kings movement is healthy for the country, Gemma, and it reminds us all of the spirit of 1776, when the American colonists summoned the great principles that rested on inalienable rights and would soon be set forth in the Declaration of Independence, and represented the idea that in America, as Thomas Paine said, the law is king. That's got to be our commitment now going forward, and there's an essential role for Americans to play in preserving our democracy.
Well, I sure appreciate your time with us, Dr. Adler. We've been speaking with Dr. David Adler, the head of the Alturas Institute. He will be at Boise's Yankee Center June 23rd from 4 to 5:30 for his latest constitutional conversation. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money Podcast from NPR.